Welcome everybody. South African Chamber of Commerce giving our event from Johannesburg this time. I am waiting for people to come into the room, which is rapidly occurring. So if you could please bear with us a moment before we start. We do have a room full of people. So if you see that I'm occupied behind me, that is true. We've got a room full of at least 30 people sharing us in person today, which is our first live stream of this nature. And thank you for being our guinea pigs and successfully joining us from the globe. And I can see we've got people from at least 3 continents joining us today. Thank you very much. I'm Sharon Constanson. I am chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce. I'm sitting in Johannesburg for the first time in 2.5 years, which is quite a wonderful experience. And I've got Johannesburg's weather at its best. Autumn, cool in the morning, warm at night, warm during the day, blue, clear skies. They're so high. The sky is so high. It's absolutely magic. So if you hear any ambient noise, everyone present is aware that they are on camera and on voice. So we will all be as quiet as we can within the room. Today, our function is to launch the Gauteng chapter of the Chamber, which I will discuss further after we've spoken to our 2 key guests, which is far more important at this moment in time to listen to the intel they're going to share with us, particularly about South Africa and value-added services to South Africa are our 2 inputs. We're being hosted by Tax Consult, who you'll be hearing from later. So whether you're a South African overseas or a South African here thinking of overseas, don't miss that section. But most importantly, I want to introduce to you Simon Freemantle, who is the Senior Political Economist for Standard Bank. He's been overseas recently and he's been traveling from the US and the UK, and will also give us some of the insights on South Africa that he picked up in the last 2 weeks. He's been with the bank for 13 years, very senior role. He has unfortunately been a step in. I do apologize, Simon, but Simon was very kind to join us because his colleague, who was chatting to us originally on ESG and inclusion, is down with a really nasty dose of COVID, for which we wish her the best, Dr. Wendy Orr. So Simon, without further ado, thank you very much for joining us. You're going to be sharing with us your insights and presentations that you've shared with the world on the political and economic landscape for South Africa looking into the future. Over to you, sir.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and good morning, everybody. I hope to do some justice to filling in for Wendy's very large shoes. So thanks for the opportunity to do so. Yes, as Sharon has mentioned, I recently went abroad. I do this routinely, but of course, COVID-19 put an end to that for a period of time. And so I went abroad a week before last to speak to our institutional clients in London and New York, largely fixed income, but also some equity clients as well. And it was interesting to just get a sense of how they are seeing South Africa currently, particularly in light of the quite bearish local sentiment towards South Africa's trajectory that you typically glean from the local investors. So there's a disconnect there that I think that is interesting to speak about. But before I do so, I just want to take you through the broad parameters of my current thinking on the political economy outlook. I'm going to do so in 2 broad sections. The first section is I'm going to speak about where I think we are making quite substantial progress. And then I'm going to go into the areas in which I think there are still material risks. My emphasis here is largely on politics and institutions. Of course, there's a much more detailed discussion around economic impediments and setbacks. But this is largely around the political and institutional backdrop, which, of course, as we know, is a large contributor towards longer term economic competitiveness and the kind of growth and output that we require in order to resolve our structural tensions. To start off with, the first point of progress that I would emphasize is that the ANC succession that we are now in the process again of considering, given that the ANC goes to its elective conference in December this year, has to a great extent been de-risked relative to the extent of the risk that was attached to the elective conference in December 2017 compared to the much lower degree of risk that is attached to the conference this year. And that's because President Ramaphosa has very successfully consolidated his power across party channels And in my view, he has a very high, I attach a 80 to 90% probability on him being re-elected in December as president for a second term at the helm of the party. Now, the de-risking of the succession process is critical because what we have seen in past ANC election years is there's been a very strong reticence from investors to make any long-term calls in the context of an ANC electoral process that could emerge with binary outcomes, either an outcome that presents the opportunity for some kind of policy reform environment to be embedded, or the alternative, an environment in which the ANC could regress even further and the institutional framework would become far more problematic for investors. Now, that has been de-risked to the extent where a Ramaphosa re-election is a very high probability event for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into in much detail now, other than to say that ANC elections are resolved by provincial and league dynamics. So the support that candidates are able to generate through those structures, and already the president has secured the endorsement of the majority of ANC provinces, and that in and of itself is sufficient to provide him with the support he requires to win in December. There is also not yet a cohesive and well-aligned candidate to oppose him in that role. And so for those and other reasons, I think his re-election is highly plausible, highly probable. What we're also likely to see in December is an improvement in the top six of the ANC generally. I think we'll have a new deputy president. I think we'll have a new secretary general. And what we have also seen as a third component of December in the recent ANC discussion documents is a substantial moderation in the ANC's tone on matters regarding economic recovery and economic development more generally. So 5 years ago, when the ANC conference emerged, there was a great deal of talk within the party around radical economic transformation. Some of the apex priorities included things like nationalizing the Reserve Bank, considering prescribed assets, and of course, a much more adversarial approach towards land expropriation without compensation. Now, if you consider the ANC's recent discussion documents, its tone on all of those matters has softened considerably as awareness has grown within the party and across government that the economic recovery that is required after the enormous harm that has been suffered as a result of COVID-19 is reliant to a great extent on tapping into the private sector balance sheet, given the lack of fiscal resources that we have within the state, and of course, a poor capacity and a poor ability to implement reforms, largely as well due to declining trust relative or related at least to the ethical breaches that have been characterized and chronicled through the State Capture Commission of Inquiry over the course of the past 3 or 4 years. So in the current discussion documents, there's no mention of prescribed assets. There's no mention of expropriation without compensation, other than to say that the approach that is now being taken differs from that proposed 4 years ago, and farmers will now be encouraged to donate land. State land will be used more effectively to redistribute in parcels to land beneficiaries to resolve land hunger. There's also a change in tone on state-owned entities, which suggests, as the finance minister has suggested for some time, that those that cannot function independently should be consolidated and potentially disposed of. Now, that kind of narrative has not been included in ANC policy documents for a very, very long time. So there's been a return to some degree of economic rationality within those policy discussions, and I think that will be formalized in December when the party, with a Ramaphosa second term, agrees on its policy priorities for the 5 years thereafter. A third area of progress relates to institutional stabilization that has been achieved since President Ramaphosa took office. There are, of course, areas of institutional weakness, which I'll deal with a little later, but what we have seen at least is new leadership across the anti-corruption task team at SARS, which has now managed to rebuild quite effectively under Edward Kisweta's leadership at various other institutions like the SIU, the asset forfeit unit within the NPA. The NPA itself has been given the opportunity, even though it may not be seizing that opportunity as vigorously as many would hope, to deliver some of the accountability for state capture abuses that was elusive in the past. And we are seeing this coming through in the data. So if you look at the World Bank's World Governance Indicators, there are 6 measures for governance that are tracked across all 180 countries in the world that they measure. And South Africa has seen a material improvement or stabilization in 4 of those 6 measures since 2017. Our control of corruption score has moved back into positive terrain. Our democracy score has improved, and our political stability score has also improved quite demonstrably as well. Now, in my interactions internationally, these are features of South Africa's outlook, which are far stronger than our peer emerging markets like Brazil, Mexico, Turkey. Of course, other EMs are finding it far harder to engage in these kinds of institutional reforms. And to an extent, the relatively favorable views towards South Africa from the international institutional investor community are to some extent because of extraordinary volatility in other emerging markets. Russia and Turkey are now effectively uninvestable for many of these large funds. And so emphasis does draw to emerging markets that are making less of those political and institutional mistakes and are starting to deliver some reform in key policy areas, as we appear to be doing. Another area where I believe there has been progress is in the delivery of structural economic reforms. Now, this is not something that we've been able to celebrate for much of President Ramaphosa's time in office. Certainly his first 3 years, we saw very little delivery of the long-awaited and much promised structural macroeconomic and microeconomic reforms that were required in order to stabilize our outlook. In the last 12 months, we've seen material shifts in that regard. We now have a degree of energy reform, which is starting to manifest in new investment and will eventually materialize in a reduction in load shedding risk as private generation capacity gets added to the grid. This week, you would have seen the first 2 projects linked to the 100 megawatt allowance have been registered, both of 100 megawatts, and power should start to be generated from those projects within the next year and a half. We also know that Eskom's unbundling is broadly on track and should be finalized, at least legally, by December this year. Bid window 6 was opened earlier this year, and later this year, we should see additional capacity coming onto the system through bid windows 4 and later on through bid window 5 as well. In transport, we're seeing Transnet engage in private engagements around third-party freight rail access, private investment in some of our port management facilities. We are seeing a far greater focus in the water sector, again, trying to crowd in the private sector to fund some of the more critical maintenance and infrastructure build priorities there, led to a great extent by the new Minister, Senzo Mkhunu, and the new DG at Water and Sanitation, Sean Phillips, who was seconded, or at least was taken from his role previously in the presidency working on Operation Vulindlela. And finally, we have auction spectrum, a decade too late, but it has happened nonetheless. And Telkom's legal application against that process has been rescinded. And the effects of that will also play out over the medium term, not only in the telco sector, but in the economy more generally. These reforms have been enabled by the president's consolidation, by a strengthened presidency now with 20 task teams and bringing in the private sector into the presidency's functions, by Operation Vulindlela and its effectiveness as a reform agent within the state, and by a reduction in ideological resistance to the idea of private interaction with the state to enable economic recovery and broader development. We know that there's been a degree of dogmatism within the ANC around that dynamic for a prolonged period of time. COVID-19 and the extraordinary fiscal harm that was introduced as a result of the lockdowns and the global economic conditions has reduced ideological resistance to this necessity, given, as I said earlier, that the state lacks the fiscal resources or the capacity to drive recovery, and therefore the private sector has been given a far larger role in driving those processes. Another area in which I would argue we have seen progress is in the delivery of more elaborate social welfare in a fiscally sustainable way. Now, of course, the commodity windfall from last year has helped us tremendously to fund the extension of the social relief of distress grant. Hopefully, we will have some degree of windfall effect later this year, given that commodity prices generally remain high and are likely to at least for much of this year. That commodity effect may wane over the medium term, but for now at least, we have managed, as the country has managed, to deliver an additional 10 million social grants to those most in need and those who have been most acutely affected by the effects of the pandemic. Now, the COVID-19 grant has been shown to be effective, not only in reducing poverty and inequality, but a UCT study done last year showed that COVID grant recipients were 25 percentage points more likely to look for work than those who were not receiving the grant. So there is a longer-term influence of more elaborate social welfare, also in reducing socio-political discontent and reducing the potential for unrest. that can emerge as a result of South Africa's various economic challenges and high levels of inequality and unemployment. And I imagine that the extension of social welfare to now cover 47% of the population is a feature in that sort of longer term social equilibrium that needs to be struck. And the last area that I would emphasize as a point of potential progress or positive development, at least, and this is something I emphasized internationally at some length, is that South Africa has now, as a function of last year's local government elections, we have seen another indication of a post-ANC political reality starting to emerge. So for a long period of time, there was no clarity as to what a post-ANC political environment would look like, given the ANC was so dominant, its hegemony was so entrenched across all sectors of our country. Now, at least, we see the ANC having lost power in all three of the large Gauteng metros, likely in the coming weeks to lose the very tenuous coalition that it was able to strike to govern in eThekwini, in which case it's likely eThekwini is going to go to the opposition as well, knowing that Cape Town has long since been run by the DA. So effectively, the country's metros are now opposition run in the main. And the ANC's reaction to that has been nowhere near as hostile or as regressive as many people assumed it would be, although there are aspects of sabotage within the bureaucracy that are concerning for the current opposition governments. But that's a secondary point. The main point I want to emphasize with this is that in last year's elections, the ANC fell substantially in its aggregate share of the vote. So too did the DA. And yet the EFF, which in many ways is seen as a threat or a challenge to some of the policy reforms that are required to stabilize the economy, flatlined. They underperformed in those elections. The successes were largely achieved by parties that are economically conservative. Now, they may be generating votes on the basis of anti-foreigner populism, which introduces all manner of risks for South Africa's longer-term political outlook. But from an economic and markets perspective, it doesn't appear, at least from what we have seen thus far, that the shift away from the ANC in the context of a weak and underperforming DA is going to see our political terrain shift towards more radical leftist populism, as some would have assumed to be the case, given our underlying social and economic tensions. From a macro perspective, as I said, we expect, based on the current reform agenda, that trend growth will move back to 2%. But for this year and next, load shedding is going to have an extraordinarily harmful effect on growth. This year, we expect the extent of load shedding will probably shave between 1 and 1.5 percentage points off our growth outlook, in which case that certainly adds constraints to the outlook, as it will next year and perhaps even quite likely in the year thereafter. So we're some way away from these reforms showing up in terms of 2-3% growth, largely because load shedding is eroding a lot of the gains that would have come about as a result of the reforms that are being implemented. Lastly, you may have seen S&P at the end of last week placing South Africa on positive outlook, which was not expected. We anticipated they would keep us on stable at best, and yet their indication that they are now placing South Africa on a positive outlook suggests that they believe in the credibility of fiscal consolidation and that they are seeing encouraging signs around the implementation of structural reform. However, and in my last 5 or 6 minutes, I'll just deal with what remain to be substantial impediments to our political economy in the foreseeable future. The first is that while the president has consolidated effectively in the ANC, the ANC as an institution is in a state of disarray and dysfunctionality. The party has acknowledged this in its discussion documents. It talks about the party being in an existential crisis. It feels as though this crisis is unlikely to be resolved. And in the foreseeable future, the ANC will not be capable of the kind of renewal that is being suggested within party channels. And so the ANC's instability will continue to play out in various areas in the political economy. And as we saw in a dramatic fashion last year, factional tensions within the party were a primary feature in driving the unrest in KZN and Gauteng in July. So the instability in the ANC remains a fundamental source of concern in our political outlook. A second factor is that while the ANC's electoral hegemony slides, we see more open spaces emerging for coalitions. Now, coalitions, as we know, anywhere in the world can be highly unstable, and it can be difficult to deliver on meaningful policy reform when the coalition dynamics are not supportive of that kind of central positioning. We also know that as the ANC's broad church starts to be dismantled, as its credibility wanes across the country in acting as a catch-all for a variety of ethnic and various other constituencies, it'll be easier for political parties to pander to identity politics, to grow their constituencies in smaller provinces and potentially also some urban areas too. So the polarization of our political space could be a consequence of the ANC's reduced electoral and institutional hegemony. We also know that while South Africa is, in my view, very far from what one would characterize as state failure, and I think the characterization of South Africa as a failed state or as a potentially failed state is largely out of sync with our institutional realities, as well as the discussion globally around state failure generally. But we have become a lot more fragile. And if you look at the State Fragility Index, we've shifted downwards from 132nd in the world, with the 180th being the strongest state, which is currently Finland, down to 89th. So we've dropped 50 ranking points in the space of 15 years. The areas in which we have become increasingly vulnerable are largely around our economy. Economic weaknesses are weakening the capacity of our state to respond to social and political tensions. Our security apparatus has become weaker, and that undermines the ability of government to respond to threats, as we saw in July last year, which have had enormous economic and sentiment effects. Another reason for this decline is because of what's referred to as factionalized elites, and that is largely a crisis within the ANC as the party's divisions have become so much more pronounced, and a reduction in state legitimacy. And we see that in trust. In the Afrobarometer survey done not long ago, we saw surveys, or at least respondents in South Africa, showed a remarkable drop in trust for key state institutions. So, for instance, those who were surveyed, 41% said they have no trust at all in the police. This is up from 18% in 2012. Similarly, local government council, 40% said they had no trust at all, up from 20% 8 years ago. And even in Parliament, 33%, no trust at all. In the president, almost a third stated that they didn't have any trust at all in the president. So there is a decline in trust in government and in the state more generally. And we're seeing that also manifesting in things like vigilantism and extra state official activities in provinces where political contestation is most pronounced, such as Gauteng. Related to that, of course, there are other governance gains that the president and government more generally has not acted decisively enough to resolve, particularly around the crisis within the police service, which cascades from the leadership down to those at the ground level. And resolving that is going to be a critical component of South Africa's longer term stabilization. So, of course, resolving these tensions, just to conclude, will have to be a key aspect of President Ramaphosa's second term. I think it is, as I said earlier, highly probable that he will be given that second term. And even if the ANC doesn't manage to secure 50% on its own at the national elections in 2024, I still think that a coalition agreement that is struck will include the ANC, or at least the president that is elected in parliament following those elections will very likely be President Ramaphosa for a second term at the state level. So there's a degree of continuity there that I think does add some opportunity for progress and does allow the continuation of some of the policy and macro reforms that we've started to see. But of course, the outlook is laced with these institutional near-term and longer-term risks that will have to be resolved far more urgently in order for that growth trajectory to shift from 2% upwards into an environment in which we can begin to more materially resolve our structural tensions. One final point on the mismatch or the disconnect between local and international investor perceptions. As I said earlier, the international perceptions were generally constructive towards South Africa. There was a view that of the EMs, South Africa shows relative progress. We are seeing the right kinds of policy reforms being spoken about and in some part delivered on. We're seeing a head of state whose consolidation is giving some stability to the outlook, a reserve bank that is independent, and a fiscal consolidation path that is broadly responsible and appears to have the political buy-in to be sustained over the medium term. And the same cannot be said of many other EMs where populism is far more prevalent, particularly in the context of monetary and fiscal policy. But at the same time, local sentiment continues to be dragged back by the effect of load shedding, which is not only a retardant to growth, but it is also extremely harmful for sentiment on a routine basis. as well as a breakdown in the rule of law. Shamila Batohi recently said in Parliament that the rule of law in South Africa is on life support. Now, that's a fairly dramatic statement for the head of your prosecuting authority to make. And I think South Africans, quite understandably, suffer from the consequences of that breakdown far more than the international community, who are looking at SA from a much more broader, macro, longer-term perspective would necessarily. So I think that in some way rationalizes the disconnect between favorable international sentiment and much more bearish local sentiment, which then again says, as a final point, that those have to be the more near-term priorities for the president, resolving to some extent the rule of law crisis that we're in. It's the one area in the World Bank, World Governance indicators that we have not improved in the last 4 years. In fact, we've continued to decline. And the other, of course, is in showing far more urgency in resolving the electricity crisis and reducing the effect of load shedding on growth and sentiment over the medium term. Sharon, let me stop there after that prolonged monologue. I hope I haven't overshot my time.
You haven't at all, and I've been taking notes, and I've got a couple of questions that I would like to start with. If I could ask those in the room who've got a short, sharp question to ask of Simon, please, you have the first honor to ask any questions. I will start, so you've got time to think and get your heads into gear. We talk about the opportunity of the ANC reducing their majority to under 50% to 48%, 46%, potentially even 42%. Based on those potential outcomes to the ANC's position, who would be likely coalition partners that would make sense?
So I think that right now, it is hard to see which parties the ANC could functionally coalesce with. I mean, we know that the ANC has worked quite well with the IFP in KZN, in municipalities, for much of the democratic era. There have been coalitions between the ANC and IFP in many areas. Now, some of those have broken down recently. Some of them have consolidated. So at a macro level, the idea of an ANC-IFP coalition is not implausible. IFP is probably going to have new leadership in 2024 as well, so there'll be a change in its approach to some extent in that regard. But I think President Ramaphosa is actually looking for the kinds of coalitions that will help him deliver reform. And in some ways, I sense he identifies an opportunity in the ANC dropping below 50, in which case he would need opposition support in order to deliver on reforms, in which case resistance to those reforms from within the ANC could be less pronounced. You can say to the ANC, we have to do this, otherwise we are not going to be capable of sustaining our national majority. So in a sense, I think he would like to build partnerships with parties that share his views on the policy reform agenda. Now, the DA, or as internally challenged, and as I would argue its legitimacy crisis is becoming more pronounced as its leadership positions in ways that are not broadly popular. But at the same sense, in the same breath at least, the DA and the ANC currently disagree on increasingly little when it comes to the policy reform agenda. There is agreement on energy, there's agreement on some of the private interaction in transport and so on. So tactical agreements on legislation rather than broad functional coalitions between parties. I think a DA-ANC coalition is highly unlikely to be formalized. But tactical agreements on which policies should be pushed through Parliament is quite plausible between those two parties. But I sense that there is going to be a new political movement between now and 2024, which will identify an opportunity in the center of our political discourse. A party that emerges, largely focused on Gauteng, although not exclusively, that looks to grow its base on the basis of voters who have no longer support the ANC, although used to, perhaps in the 90s and early 2000s, gave the DA a chance, but have since fallen out of favor, no longer are interested in endorsing the DA given its various leadership challenges, and are looking for an alternative, a centrist, conservative, pragmatic alternative, which appeals to a sort of middle-class vote within Gauteng in particular. And I think that, I know that there are discussions around the creation of that alternative. And I think that could give President Ramaphosa an alternative working coalition partner out in 2024, particularly in the environment, like you say. If the ANC goes to 48, they need very few seats to push through their mandate in the National Assembly. 42% is very different. 42%, you're in an environment in which the opposition may rally together, as there are some discussions led by Bantu Holomisa already, to create pre-election coalitions of the opposition on the principle that if the ANC is drawn below 50, the opposition will then rule, although he even said to me recently that in such an environment, the ANC would be included in a coalition arrangement. And it's quite plausible that President Ramaphosa would still be elected as head of state, despite the ANC not securing the majority. So there are various constellations that could emerge in 2024, very much reliant on how far below the 50% mark the ANC falls, if indeed it does fall. My current feeling is it's more likely that if it falls below 50, it'll be closer to 48 than it will be to 42, in which case a coalition would not need to be as grand to undermine the kind of policy reform agenda that the president appears to be seeking to put in place.
I think any Brit listening to 48 must think, oh my God, Brexit vote.
Yeah.
It must terrify the life out of them because it's not strong enough to be anything one way or anything the other way. So that would be an interesting one. What do you think the impact will be upon the level of corruption or expectation for self-enhancement or whatever it might be that exists within an element of the ANC? Would a coalition government have an impact on that and therefore empower the coalition government to get more things done? You talked about change in ideology, which to a way doesn't talk to that, but it might have the same outcome.
Look, I think the ANC, and it's realized, its discussion documents speak about this, that patronage has become systemic. It's rooted across the party's structures. And it's going to be exceptionally difficult to change that trajectory that it's on in that sense. So power, the contestation for power at provincial and regional and local level in the ANC is less and less about ideology. It's less about principle. It's less about individuals. You know, do I support Ramaphosa or not? It's more about groupings that are constellated around local leaders. And if that local leader were to be elected into position, there is an expectation that the benefits of patronage will flow to that person's networks and will exclude the networks of the person that is opposing him or her in the chairperson challenge or what have you. And we've seen this playing out in the Eastern Cape recently. We've seen it playing out in eThekwini. We saw it playing out in Mpumalanga, which led to the conference being effectively 4 years overdue because the province couldn't get to a point where it could functionally hold a conference in the context of these very violent factional contestations happening across the party, to the point where President Ramaphosa spoke at the Mpumalanga at the end of the conference and said the house is on fire. And Paul Mashatile said we face an existential crisis. So they're speaking openly in a way to suggest that this patronage and the systemic nature of it is so rooted now that it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to unravel that. But you can at least reduce its effect on institutional performance. So what we saw in the previous administration is that there was no accountability. In fact, your observance and your buy-in to that patronage system would allow you to elevate your access within political structures. If you can change approach to at least have some accountability and shift the dynamics institutionally so that there is corruption, because there always will be in any market in the world, and particularly in a relatively vulnerable emerging market such as ours, but the extent of it is not such that it attacks the credibility of key institutions and it undermines service delivery to the point where we are having an increasing number of local governments collapse or being unable to deliver on basic services. I think what we could see is not an entire organic change in the nature of patronage in the ANC, but rather a reduction in the kinds of damage that patronage system delivers in delivery of services and in the capacity of key institutions to function independently, like Treasury, like the Reserve Bank and SARS, and so on. So there's a stabilization at that macro level. But a holistic reform of the system appears to me to be highly unlikely. So a coalition, for example, would have to realize that. There would have to be an acknowledgement that there will still be some degree, quite an advanced degree of patronage determining political outcomes in provinces and in key areas where the ANC and others retain majority control. But if you can limit the harm that is done by that, then of course that has to be seen as some progress.
Thank you very much. Anybody in the room got a question?
My question is around the solution of employment for young people. So we constantly talk about that as a crisis. Do you see the programs that are currently in place as working and functional and should be strengthened and supported? And the second question is looking at the informal sector. Working in youth development, we know that that's a very strong, rife sector. There's a lot of cash around. There is actually stuff working, and the crisis is therefore not as big as anticipated, just because it's not measured.
Yeah.
How does that form into some reform structure, or how do we acknowledge what is there?
Yeah. No, thank you for pointing that out. That second point is a particularly important one when talking about South Africa's resilience, because so often we hear unemployment is 40+%. The country has to collapse. It has to succumb to its various economic pressures because that is just an obviously unsustainable level of unemployment. But of course, the unemployment rate at the official level very likely doesn't capture the extent of informal activity. For example, and I'm sure you're much more familiar with the data around this, but a gross total food and grocery sales annually in South Africa are in the region of 620 billion rand. But the formal retailers only account for about half of that. And it's projected that grocery sales will increase to around 750 billion within the next 2 or 3 years. And still, formal retailers, including discount retailers in informal areas, are still only going to account for half of those total sales. So you're talking about an informal sector that is as large as the formal one when it comes to the distribution and sale of groceries across the country. That's quite an extraordinary statistic, which emphasizes the extent of informal activity, which in itself is a buffer to some of the other the threat of social unrest that one would assume would be there if you just look at our highest level of inequality in the world and one of the highest levels of youth unemployment in the world. But that doesn't mean we should be distracted from the imperative to create more lines of formal employment. Right now, I don't see much of that. I mean, there is the presidential employment plan. There are youth employment objectives being governed through, given some fiscal support, but they're not going to be sufficient to really shift the needle on the youth unemployment crisis. I think for that, we have to pay far more attention on fixing education. And right now, I worry that we're in an environment in which we're responding urgently to the crises that are flashing the most abundantly on the dashboard. And load shedding is one. And of course, crime and instability and security threats is another. And I worry that the education crisis is flashing, but it isn't as prominent as the others. And in that sense, it's not being given the priority that it should. It was given 2 sentences in the State of the Nation address, whereas the energy crisis was given 2 pages. And so I worry that resolving education, or basic education in particular, is not likely to be tackled particularly progressively in the next 3, 4, 5 years, in which case, as an underlying source of our youth unemployment challenge, that will remain a prominent tension. Another factor is, of course, your economy growing at 2%, while that allows you to have a degree of fiscal sustainability, it's generally regarded that below 2%, you're not adding jobs, at least not in a material fashion. So we need to be growing at a trend rate of far higher than 2% for us to be able to start to create additional employment in a material way. So until the economy is growing at a trend growth rate of more than 2%, and until we can start to resolve basic education challenges in a more progressive way, I do worry that youth unemployment will remain a very pronounced challenge, buffered at least by, as you say, the extent of informal activity and by the extension of social welfare, which is now permanent, right? So the social relief of distress grant is referred to as temporary, but it is not temporary. It is now a formal permanent grant that will continue to be distributed to the constituency between 18 and 60 that are unemployed and can and fulfill the eligibility criteria. So that will be one buffering effect of that challenge. One last thing that I'll say is if you read the ANC's discussion documents, there is at least an emphasis on building the informal economy, or at least supporting the informal economy, building the township economy and so on. But this has been spoken about in the past, and I'm not yet convinced that it's going to be given the kind of structural support that is required for it to more materially contribute to growth and productivity going forward.
Thank you very much, Simon. I hate to do this, and to everybody else who's got a million questions, we're going to have to move on to our host because I think it would be rude not to at this point. Simon, are you going to be staying with us?
Yes,
if you do need to drop off, you can do. That's fantastic. If we've got time at the end, we can maybe have a bit of an informal conversation. But at this point in time, I have changed my identity to Jerry Buerta of Tax Consult, and Jerry will swap seats. Jerry is a very strong supporter of the Chamber. He's joined the UK Chamber as a platinum member recently and is offering a cornerstone support to the Gauteng chapter as being part of the on-the-ground solutions that we're going to be looking at.
Thank you for the kind introduction, everyone. I know each of you attending have got your own story, and we love people's personal story. Some have tougher paths than others, and I think we kind of all got through COVID. And I think the commonality amongst us all is we are all passionate about a bit of international trade and stuff across border. And I left the world of the Big Four many years ago, which was a tough decision. I still sometimes dream, how did I do that? I was very happy there, but we kind of have humbly grown into South Africa's largest independent tax practice. We're about 150 people strong. We don't compete with other accountants or tax lawyers. We more work with them. We've got our game and they've got their game. And thank you for all coming here. I think special word of thanks to the association. I think in the chamber. I mean, it's volunteer time. I think it's very important that when you deal with Sharon and her supporters, that you realize they don't get paid for what they're doing. Yeah, they don't, like all of us, sit here with some sort of a commercial interest. And for that, we're very appreciative. And thank you for giving us that opportunity. So just in terms of our firm, I mean, what we see in the world, tough to kind of follow the previous act in terms of the big picture. We're more the guys in the trenches that see what's happening. 113,000 odd taxpayers in South Africa that earn more than 1.5 million per year, according to SARS. We're not talking about the guys it's not on record. And that 113,000, they contribute, I think, 26.7% of total revenue towards the fiscus. Of the 14 million taxpayers in South Africa on record, more than half of that pay zero income tax. So I always wonder how much time SARS spent administering people paying zero income tax. We see amazing things as a tax practice. It's interesting and it's tough times out there. Rules are not always followed, and revenue authorities are aggressive. And if you look at the biggest expense item, not that I'm an economist in any way, shape, or form, but the biggest expense item per this year's budget for the next 4 years, which has got a 10.7% growth per year, is government's cost of servicing debt. That's by far the largest growth number. That means they're spending more than they're collecting. And where does that money go to? And that's a little bit of stealing off tomorrow. And that, of course, makes many South Africans a bit nervous or negative. And I think we see a massive movement of South Africans abroad. We by far have the largest practice of South Africans moving abroad, or at least their money moving abroad. And I think just to give you kind of a sense of that, we probably deal with about on average between 400 or 500 South Africans per month going out. So that move is big. And if you just talk to, we were in the Netherlands, I think last week or the week before. I'm not, like Sharon, I'm not sure in what country I'm always, or city, what bed I'm waking up in. But Netherlands, I think 35,000 South African professionals. And of that 35,000, I think 20,000 is working professionals. I'm talking proper, highly qualified professionals. 15,000 is spouses and children, stuff like that. They've got exact detail, 302 Dutch companies into South Africa. And they're looking for more. They love South Africans. And if I go to the UK and I look at what's happening there and the shortage of skills there, and the huge low employment issue there, there's huge opportunities there as well. The world wants South Africans. And we as a firm, of course, for those that don't know, exchange control, it's still a bit of a pain, but it doesn't really exist. You can move any amount of money abroad. We've about 3 weeks ago got approval to move about 170 million abroad. 2 days ago, I got approval to move an amount abroad of well over $1 billion. And that is for an individual, not for a family. And that is not asset swap stuff. You know, you put money abroad and it's an asset swap. That is literally South Africa getting poorer of somebody moving abroad and going. And it's an easy mathematical calculation for some. If you take 45% income tax, you take 25% estate duty, there ain't that much left, you know. So we see that. But then we also see the other part. We've got the largest immigration practice in South Africa. Our largest client, and we humbly claim to be the biggest, not in terms of perhaps number of clients, but in terms of sheer volume of permits. Our highest client has got over 1,200 skilled permits into South Africa. And we see so many people from abroad coming to South Africa that don't want to leave. They love it here. We see so many South Africans abroad coming back here and working remotely and resetting up here. We see a lot of clients investing into South Africa for Africa or investing back into South Africa. So it's very, very difficult to kind of talk about a trend here because we see all of that. And I think that for everybody that's here, you're here because there's some South Africa UK link here. You know, whether you're moving there, whether you're moving back, whether you've got some sort of a business relationship. But I think these are exciting times. And when I was in London, I think it's about a month ago or so, it is end of March. For somebody that's not been in the UK for 2 years, it's shocking for me how Brexit has hit that economy. You see it. When you go to Piccadilly Circus that you could not walk before, and now 2 of the most biggest shops right at that center is huge and open. It's got an impact on you. And that is not a negative. That is opportunity. It will go back. So I think a benefit of association like this is that you can communicate with your peers. You can get quick answers. I often say I've not inherited anything in life, kind of, which is a good thing. I probably would have just lost it all. I'm the type that kind of grows with scars on my back. And if you do move internationally or not, I think you can. It's such a wealth of wisdom to talk to Sharon in terms of how other guys have done it, that they don't have that scars on their back. And if she doesn't know the answer, she'll tell you who to go to. And if you've got if you ever need a office space as an association member or want a meeting, you're welcome here. We've got lots of space. We don't believe in fighting for a piece of the pie. It's not how we operate. And if you ever need foreigners, South Africans, to move to the UK, we sort out those visas and those structures. If you've got from the UK coming to South Africa, we're very comfortable to kind of deal with that stuff and the more complicated things. In terms of the critical skills in South Africa, we did the survey that informed the South African critical skills list. And I can tell you there's a massive amount of shortage of skills in South Africa. You know, it is, if you speak to corporate after corporate, they just cannot find a certain skill set. And that skill set, it's not just us, we're competing globally against that. And I still think we see a lot of those skills do come to South Africa because South Africa offer opportunity for some. So there is a big skill shortage here. And I think we are in a very blessed time in terms of where we live in life, that there's so much opportunity, and I hope to meet all of you. Lastly, guys, we wrote the book on expat tax, the first and the second one. I had to go search for a book because we don't really have it in the office. We're very privileged that we were asked to do the writing of this. Please, you don't, LexisNexis ask us to do this because we're passionate about this area. We don't make money from selling a book, but if you if you look at our second edition, you see it's about 10% longer because SARS keeps legislating against expats the whole time. Of course, the number one topic there is there's no doubt in my mind that somebody in National Treasury or SARS or somebody that wants money is looking at the pension fund money. If you look at the legislative changes in terms of where does a pot of gold sit, there's definitely a little bit of a look at the legislation around pension. And last year on the pension fund law, where they wanted to kind of tax you even though you don't withdraw your money, we were in Parliament that fought that thing to say you can't do that contrary to your double tax treaties. And then this year they said, okay, we agree to that point, you're right, but guess what, we're going to go and renegotiate those treaties. So I do think I'm not a financial advisor in any way. I've got all the qualifications to be one, but I ain't. If you want to know what the Rand's going to do, probably do the opposite what I do. You to ask Standard Bank, they're smart with those things. But I do think you need to be diversified in terms of your assets, and you need to proceed with caution, I think, in terms of where the world is. Thank you for this time and opportunity, Sharon. Deeply appreciative of your time, and I hope to meet all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. That was extremely interesting. Jerry is a minefield of information, and every time he speaks, I learn more. I think, oh my God, really? Better be careful. So honestly, through the chamber, make contact with us. We'll make contact with Tax Consult and Expat Web. Marissa Ward did pop her head in a little bit earlier from Expat Web, but I think we all decided we didn't want to catch her cold. So I think the office sent her home. She wasn't in a good way. So she runs that part of the business. What I would like to do now is just give you a very, very brief, because of time necessity, of how the chamber is structured, how we act, how we are busy doing things. And then I'm going to hand over to Sean behind me very quickly to talk about the Gauteng chapter itself within that structure. The chamber is a matrix. We have the chamber being the South African Chamber of Commerce UK Limited, which is the legal entity that is based in the UK, and it is a full legal company in that environment. But how am I going to be relevant to you if I'm sitting in the UK and you don't even know I exist, least of all any other further information about me? So the importance that we thought was, how do we reach the people? How do we find out what you need? How are we going to help you to trade internationally in the way that would be an enhancement? Do you want to take a seat in the front, ma'am? There's a seat there. So if we look at the structure beneath that to become relevant to our environment, we created a matrix of geographic and special interest chapters. So our geographic chapters started first by being understood to be a London-centric organization, because pre-COVID, all our events were held in London. So therefore, most of our members were local South Africans in London. Well, that wasn't going to do much for trade internationally, seeing as we are the Chamber of Commerce, not the beer drinking club. Now, a lot of our original individual members did come from the South African Business Club, which is exactly what that was. It was good fun, get together, have a beer and burgers. And we had to change that into a business entity that we are today. So the focus then was on creating the regional chapters within the UK. We have Scotland, East of England, are the two most active chapters that we have in that area. We have others that are growing as well. The Cambridge one, for example, in East of England had 21 people for breakfast the other day. And that was just so exciting to see all those local South Africans in Cambridge getting together and sharing business ideas. We then expanded it to the territories, we call it, I can't remember the exact protectorates or whatever they call. No, it's not, there's another word. Guernsey, Jersey, Isle of Man. Now, Isle of Man has got a population of 70 odd people, of which 11,000 are South Africans. Jersey has something like 7,000 South Africans, and Guernsey has something like 5,000 South Africans with these very small populations. Most of them are professionals, you do get a very strong element of them in the Isle of Man that are in the support services and in the hospitality sector and in health. In the UK, we've got something like 700,000 South Africans. So we've got a large number that we can reach, who can then talk to businesses here and either export to you, import from you, but equally to support finding a market for your products in those markets. So we have the geographic chapters, which then expanded, and we've come to South Africa, and we've created 3 chapters in South Africa: Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Gauteng. And for example, I've now done a whole tour, and we're launching Gauteng today. KZN, we did a Dragon's Den equivalent where we got 6 companies and a tour of a shoe factory, where we got people together to talk about what their export desires were. And that was really interesting because they got to share this knowledge between them and with ourselves. And we could think of where we could help them with markets offshore. They weren't what they could do with each other. It was the most productive Dragon's Den, because it wasn't a Dragon's Den, but people made friends in a way that only the Chamber could have achieved. And we worked with the Durban Chamber, who is a partner of ours, and we partner with many of the other chambers, of which we've got some present today. And that's just the power of coming to the community, talking to the community and having events in a local environment. And that is the importance of how we can support our purpose as the Chamber, which is to uplift the lives of South Africans. And the only way we can do that is in our remit and ambit is through international trade. We do have, through our revamp strategy, the opportunity to get involved in the social welfare, charity, philanthropic areas as well, to ensure that we can showcase and give space to those markets as well, so that people know what good is being done on the ground, which I must admit does blow my mind what has happened. You were talking about education. I mean, what's happening in the ground with the private sector in education, feeding, and unemployment is just mind-boggling, and schooling. It's just incredible what you guys are all doing, which 25 years ago just wasn't happening in this country. So things have changed dramatically. The next matrix level we have, and then I'm going to stop, is we have special interest chapters. Some people only want to join because I'm a digital guru and I sit in my room and I don't want to go past that space. Yeah, I would be keen to meet somebody in the US or the UK or in Singapore that also have my interests. So we have 9 special interest groups. And I won't remember all of them, but ESG, financial services, trade, Africa, young professionals, professional women, I'm running out of steam, but digitals, and the youth I've talked about. So I haven't got all of them, but that just gives you an idea of where we are focusing on to make sure that we can be relevant to your interest as well as your location. So we'll get people that are matrixing across those. So you can go into webinars of an event that's digital in Gauteng, but you're sitting somewhere else. Last level of matrix areas that the Chamber has achieved is we hold the chair and founding position of the Council of Foreign Chambers of Commerce. Now, in London, there are 50-odd foreign chambers, of which we are one. We now have the Council of Foreign Chambers, which is a membership of 24 chambers that are international, into which you get a reach through the South African Chamber. So all the European, Scandinavian, Asian, we've got a good mix of chambers across the globe. And we're in formation and working and planning on the growth of, or the creation of, the formal global South African chambers. And that is Mauritius, USA, Singapore, Middle East, all the chambers like us that are global, and we're all joining together as well. So as a council, not doing things instead of each other, but combining resources, combining skills, doing work, combined events. So you have that reach through that South African network as well. So that's what we can offer as the Chamber. But I'm going to stop now because we are over time by 1 minute. I'm sorry, Sean. I'm now going to change my identity quickly again to Sean Godoy. Sean is the lead for the Gauteng Chamber chapter. Listen to me.
I'll keep it very brief. Thanks again to Jerry and his team and Tax Consult for hosting us, and for everyone for being here in person and online. It's just really encouraging. I'm super excited about the Gauteng chapter. And I think we're going to do some great things. And I think, it's all about connecting passionate South Africans and people interested in South Africa and vice versa with the UK. So just on my side, I'm a passionate South African, and I spent a few years working and living in London, and the plan was always to come back. And I got involved in the chamber in London, and it was really amazing as a passionate South African to connect with that community, and you can have an impact in your own small way. And the power of African diasporas is immense. We see that in many African countries, and I think we've got a lot to harness with the South African diaspora that's already happening. So the chamber really does plug a lot into that. And obviously Sharon covered it. It's very broad, it's very connected, and it has influence in a lot of ways. And it is about promoting the business community and charitable exchanges between the UK and South Africa, but at the same time, it's really broad, which is fantastic with the international footprint and connection. So as the Gauteng chapter, like Sharon explained, it made sense to have chapters focusing on different communities. So it started in the UK and it expanded to the protectorates, or whatever they're called. We'll get the right word just now. Principality, that's the Vatican. So yeah, it made a lot of sense. And then I moved back in 2017, and I was an EXCO member in the UK, and I've kind of said I'll be the man on the ground in Joburg, and if anyone needs help. So try to do that, but this is now obviously formalizing that, and it's crucial in our 3 key provinces, 3 cities, that we have that representation so we can meet people on the ground. We can add value, meet the objectives of the chamber, and actually meet in person, quite over Zoom. And I think we all like to get together. So I think it's really important, and it goes both ways. Obviously, if there's UK or other businesses, individuals coming here, there's that community objective, the business objective, and then going to the UK. It's a wonderful market for South African businesses. And another thing to stress is the focus on SMEs to corporates, because historically chambers of commerce are corporate, they're miners, they're banks, but they're still crucial. But now the SMEs, which is such a crucial element of the South African economy, we're really focusing. And like Sharon said, these specialist elements are really exciting. I had a call with the gentleman who's head of the Startup Digital Committee in the main chapter. And I've invited some SMEs here who are interested in the UK. So it really is exciting. And the connections that we have in business and diplomatic and etc. It gives us a lot of options. And at the end of the day, we're passionate South Africans, and I'm a passionate connector, and that's what we do. Just to end off, Simon and Jerry, thanks so much for those insights. I like the balance between positive and negative, because as a South African who returned, basically every single one of my South African CA friends in London asked me why. And I say it's personal and it's business. So on both fronts, they're like, why personal and why business? So I came back as a passionate entrepreneur, but I think it's important not to be blind to the challenges. But I think even more of an issue for South Africans is being blind to the opportunity and the positives. Why are there foreigners that really want to live here? South Africans have reasons to leave, and it's a natural thing to emigrate as a professional or a business owner. But we've got to change that narrative, because so much of it is not based on facts. So I think we can also do our own part there. And obviously Gauteng's role in the country, and I'm a passionate Tri-City proponent. I work in property, so Cape Town likes to think that they're the main ones, but in terms of business, everything, lifestyle, our 3 cities together can help work together and accomplish a lot. So having our 3 chapters is fantastic. So I'll end there, but I'm very open to connect and to make introductions, and we've got a lot planned. So you'll hear a lot from me, and if you want to reach out, please do. Thanks. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone.
To everyone who's joined us today, thank you very much. I think it was a very successful launch, and thanks to those in present. This is the first one we've done in person, which makes Gauteng extra special for us. And to be hosted by tax consultant Jerry, standing there watching me, who has now allowed us to move out of this room into a nicer area. We've got a bit more space to breathe. and we'll have some eats and some snacks for all of us to enjoy. Sorry, guys, that you're online. You won't be able to join us in that part, but at least we've been able to do a very successful hybrid event and be able to involve those internationally in the launch of today, which is where our message is always going to be. And the importance is there will be a recording for today's event, so you can share it with anybody you wish to. Stuart, who you can see his face up there, will be the one that is going to be crown dependencies. Thank you very much for those. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. I had a complete blank on the right word. So the crown dependencies being the Jersey, Guernsey, and Isle of Man, which are the other jurisdictions that we look forward to. And thanks to everybody for the effort that we've had together. There's some messages that are coming up from those that are in the webinar. And please, will you join us for further socializing, getting to know one another? This is all about doing business together. Thank you.